Don't know how to save this recording.
I think I'm recording now. Yay, I think I've done it. It's brightening up over Johnny Beckett's.
I was born on the 23rd of November 1946 and my full name was Doris Proud.
I was born on the 31st of March 1946 at the Beeches, Warburton, which I think you know well, and my name is Veronica Louise Woolley.
My name is Guy Woolley. I was born on the 28th of March 1945.
My father came from the Isle of Man and he was called John Edward Proud. And my mother was from Padgate and she was called Harriet Proud. Welsh became Proud.
My mother's name is Kathleen Victoria Woolley, or Kay, and my dad's name was Stanley George Woolley. I was born in Warburton. I weighed £5 12 ounces.
My siblings were Guy Robert Woolley, who was born a year before me on the 28th of March, but we did have another brother who was born the year before that in 1944 in March, but sadly he was stillborn and I believe was buried somewhere in the garden at the Beeches, but Mum never knew where.
I have a brother, Brian, full name Brian Proud. Not quite sure of the date he was born. I know he's 13 years older than me, so I don't know. And then Auntie Sylvia Proud, and she was born 6 years before me. So she would have been born in 1940.
My siblings, my sister Veronica, and another baby was born before I was, but it was stillborn. The mum and dad were going to call it Rodney. It was when the war was on, and Dad was away working, Uncle Wally and Lenny were away in the army. So there was only Mum and my mother at home, and the baby was stillborn. The doctor came, and Mum said, "Well, what should we do with the baby?" He said, "Well, you better throw it on the fire," which wasn't very PC. So Mum and Mama said, "Well, we can't really do that." So they buried the stillborn baby in the garden at the Beeches somewhere, I don't know where, and it's still there somewhere.
Brian was born in Fernhead at my grandparents' house, and Sylvia was also born there, as I was.
Veronica and I grew up. We went to Warburton school together, junior school, and then Veronica, being cleverer than me, passed her 11 plus and went to Lynn Grammar, and I went to North Kestrel Grammar in Altrincham. But you had to pass an exam for that, but not an 11 plus.
Sylvia married Roger and they had 2 children, Alice and Sarah. Uncle Brian married Clary. He was married at 19, very young, and they had Karen 6 years later.
My grandmother's maiden name was Elizabeth Annie Chris.
My grandfather was William Welsh, spelt Welch, and he came from Coddington, Coddington, in Cheshire. Don't know much about him. All I know that his brother was rector at Coddington Parish Church in Cheshire.
My grandfather's name was Walter Cross.
My grandmother was called Annie Barnes, and she came from Kingsway, and she was one of 7 children.
We first lived at Warburton Post Office when I was a baby, and I lived there till I was about 5 years old.
I was born in Kings Road, Fernhead. That's in Warrington.
The first house I can remember living in was the post office in Warburton, which was opposite the beaches.
It was a nice house. So my mum ran the shop, and Dad used to go out to work as a civil engineer.
Dad ran the post office. He was the first postmaster there, and also a small general store. And I can remember us going out in the bread van with him, delivering bread around the village to various places.
That was my grandparents' house, and we lived there with my gran and granddad, Auntie Sylvia, Uncle Brian, and myself. It was quite a big house, 5 bedrooms, and my grandfather used to be a poultryman, and he kept hundreds of chickens, all free range, kept ferrets. He used to ferret for rabbits, and that's where I lived until I was 3 years old.
The house was built, you're going to be impressed with this, the house was designed by the architect John Douglas and built in the 1870s. He designed quite a few of the houses and buildings in the village, including the village school and the parish rooms next to the church, and I believe he designed the church as well.
When I was 3, my mum and dad put the name down on the council house list, and they got a brand new house at 3 Queen's Crescent, Padgate, Warrington. It was brand new. I remember going into the house. I was 3 years old. I remember it clearly. And Sylvia and I went down into the garden, and the only thing that was in the garden was a path down the middle and a clothesline. Both sides of the path was just soil. And my mum said, I'm going to make this side into a vegetable patch and the other side into a garden. So that was 47, 46, 48, 49 probably we moved into there.
We moved to the beaches then. I think I probably would have only been about 4 years old when we moved to the beaches. Mum moved across there in order to look after her mother, who was by that time unwell. So we lived there with Mum's brothers, Wally and Lenny, the twins, which was fabulous, having an extra 2 dads.
So that is where our first house was. We were very lucky to get it, as it was brand new, and the builders only built 12 houses in Queen's Crescent, and they were built for a private builder who went bust, so the council bought them off them and finished them off. We had 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, a separate toilet, an outbuilding for washing, which had an old boiler in the corner of the wash. We used to call it the wash house. There was a coal house, and it was everything my mother could have dreamed of, and she absolutely loved it.
In the house itself, I can remember the living room had a brick fireplace, which was probably put in the 30s. I can remember standing in front of this when I had chicken pox and being stripped naked and covered all over in calamine lotion and being very itchy.
My earliest memory. Well, I remember moving into the new house, and I must have been about 3. And somewhere I've got an old photograph of Sylvia and I in the back garden holding my hand, and me looking as though I'm scratching my bottom. I'm not quite sure.
First memory, being pushed in the pram by Granny Woolley, who must have come up from London to stay with us. I can remember, and I must have only been about 2, I guess, because I was in the pram and Guy was on a little wooden tricycle, I think it was, and it started to rain, or Guy got tired, and Granny picked Guy up, put him in the other end of the pram. It's one of those big carriage type prams, and she put the tricycle across in between us. That, I think, is my very first memory
I remember the coronation, and my mother getting Sylvia and I and Brian were all dressed in red, white, and blue, and we went into Warrington to see for the celebrations of the Queen's Jubilee. And I remember sitting on my dad's shoulders so I could see the procession going by, and it was quite a spectacular sight, and I remember it very clearly.
One of the first memories when we were must be very small, Veronica and I managed to lock ourselves in our bedroom, and Uncle Jack was staying with us at the time, and he had to get a ladder, climb up to the bedroom window, open it, and then managed to unlock the door and let us out. Our parents weren't very pleased.
Back then, sweets were on ration, and I can remember going into the shop and stealing some dolly mixtures and running upstairs and hiding behind the curtain on the landing, quite convinced that nobody would know I was there, until Mum whipped the curtain back and gave me a good earwigging. But the sweets were good.
I also remember Warrington winning the Rugby Cup, and I was dressed in blue and yellow, and my dad took me to see that and the presentation and the coach coming through with the players on, and the whole town was blue and yellow Warrington colours.
Another early memory while we were still at the beaches was when Guy had his first attempt at killing me, when he had heard the tale of William Tell and thought he would emulate him, and his trusting little sister was standing with an apple on her head while he had a homemade bow and arrow. The story goes that Uncle Jack, who went to live in South Africa, was living with us at the beaches at the post office at the time, and he apparently ran down the stairs shouting, "The little bugger's got the next one aimed between her eyes." Apparently when he got there were already 2 arrows behind me, and he put a stop to Guy's ambition to become William Tell.
The other memory I have is quite young, and I was sat in a high chair, so I might have been about 2. And I remember my mother pouring gravy on my dinner, and I didn't like the gravy, and I threw it on the floor and got in terrible trouble. So those are my earliest memories.
My earliest memory is probably being in Rains I think it must have been Manchester, and I must have been pulling and screaming, and Mum trying to pull me back, and a man coming towards us just smiled, and my Mum just shook her head at him as if to say she could strangle me.
From my memories of the beaches are being incredibly cold in the winter, scraping ice off the inside of the bedroom window, being able to see your breath when you sat up in bed. Heating was just coal fires in each room. In what we called the kitchen, there was a range, and Uncle Woolley used to get up early first thing and light the fire in there. So when we came down for breakfast, at least the chill was off that room. We had a very large garden at the beaches, as some of you will be aware, and we used to have on the lawn we had a tennis court, which Guy and I marked out with very wiggly white lines, which caused lots of arguments because the cry was, well, if the line had been straight, the ball would have been in. And Guy, of course, always beat me hollow. And we made an umpire's chair out of an old crate with an old armchair on the top. Very enterprising, I thought. And then we had, beyond the brick wall, there was Wally and Lenny's vegetable garden, where they grew an amazing amount of vegetables. And then beyond that was an orchard, which was very overgrown and derelict, really. But Mum used to say that when she was young, it was all beautifully landscaped because they had 2 gardeners, a housekeeper, a maid, before Grandpa went out of business.
My very first friends lived in Queen's Crescent. My mum's next door neighbour were called the Manellis, an Irish family, and they had a daughter Kathleen and one Nora, and I played all the time with them when we lived there. And on the other side of our house, there was a family called the Lawsons, and Susan Lawson was a couple of years younger than me, but we played a lot together.
Susan Walton, she lived at Pear Tree Cottage. Her father was a labourer on one of the farms. I remember going to her house, and her mum always seemed to be baking, and there was usually fresh bread, and she used to make us sugar butties. Not a wonder my teeth have always been rotten. Sue was born in the January, as I was born in the March, and we started primary school on the same day. And I can remember when I sprained my ankle at primary school, Sue used to call for me on the way to school, and she had come on her bike because she lived about a couple of miles away, I suppose, and she used to pick me up and wheel me on her bike to school. I suppose nowadays kids probably wouldn't have bothered going in.
My first friends were, still Edward Lee and Roger Grove. We grew up together as children. We can't remember not knowing each other.
Christine Newton was my other close friend, and our mums were very close. And I think we were always at each other's houses. Chris's parents were farmers, and I used to go and stay there, and she used to come and stay at the beaches, and I suppose we were more like sisters, really. And we're still friends. And then Chris was with me when Guy had his second attempt at killing me. When Dad had built me a little brick Wendy house, and Chris had come to play, and we were in the Wendy house, which had an open fire, health and safety, and we lit the fire, and we were having pretend tea, and Guy and his friend Roger Groves, who lived across the road, they decided it'd be great fun to lock the door and put a piece of wood over the top of the chimney. So we were slowly choking to death in there, and then they started pushing worms under the door just to make things a bit more fun. Fortunately, I think they did realise that we were getting into a bit of difficulty, and they opened the door. I think had they not opened it when they did, I might not be sitting here telling you this story.
And across the road, a friend I had right through school, and from being probably 2 or 3 years old when I moved, 3 years old when we moved in there, was Gaynor Austin. And Gaynor's dad worked for Monk and Company, as my father did at the time, and we were great friends. And Mr. and Mrs. Austin were very, very kind to me, right through as long as I can remember. And they had a son called Graham Austin, and he was about 2 years older than me. And when I became about 16, Graham really fancied me. He wasn't as tall as me, he was quite short, so it put me off a bit. But he was a very clever boy, and he got his pilot's license quite young. He was a few years older than me, and unfortunately he took a plane up to the Lake District one afternoon, and he came down and he was tragically killed. He was only about 21, but still in touch with Gaynor after all these years.
Oh gosh, lots of happy memories of time with Chris. We rode our ponies together. I think when mums were going out somewhere and they wanted us looked after, they'd drop us at one or other house, so it was like having two families, really. Chris's dad was a really nice man. I can remember them having dairy cattle at one time, and Chris was very bold, brave, much braver than I was. And I can remember in the barn having they'd collected all the straw which was stacked up in the barn, and they'd taken away the centre part, so there was a rope hanging from a beam in the middle, and Chris used to swing across this gap, which we must have been about 15, 20 feet up. I wasn't brave enough. It's a wonder we ever survived, really.
I remember Ruth Lee, Edward's sister, and she still remembers we used to play marbles at the school, and she had this lovely big white marble with orange stripes round it, and she lost it to Eric Jennings, a boy called Eric Jennings, and I played Eric Jennings and I won the marble, and I gave it back to her. She still remembers that.
Then Chris and I got our ponies. I got my pony when I was 14. The uncles bought my pony for me, Ginger. Chris had a very wild horse called Flash. When she first got it, I'd gone over on Ginger to see her, and she said, "Oh, I'm not quite ready. Do you want to go and catch Flash?" So I said, yes. She said, "Oh, you better take a bucket of oats with you." So Flash was in the middle of 3 big fields, and I walked across with my bucket of oats, and Flash got near me, put her ears flat back, put her head down, charged at me, turned round and tried to kick me, and I had nowhere to go. So I stood my ground. She did the same again. I waved my arms, my heart was in my mouth, rattled my bucket of oats, tried to kick me again. It was a good job I was agile. And on her 3rd attempt, she did put her head in the bucket, and I got hold of her head collar and took her back up to the gate, where Chris was sitting on the gate, laughing her head off, saying, "I've not been able to catch her since I've had her," and she'd had her over a week. But we are still friends.
A friend from school was called Susan Plant, which I'm still in touch with on Facebook. She was one of 13 children, the youngest, and they were quite renowned in the Padgate area as being this huge family. But she's such a lovely person, and I keep in touch with her on Facebook nearly every day, and it's lovely to be back in touch with her.
Ruth Lee was another friend from those days. She was a little bit younger than me, but always was a very high intelligence. I can remember she had a jigsaw puzzle of all the counties in England, and she could do that in seconds when she was a tiny little girl. We used to play a game called Zoo Mail at their wonderful birthday parties, and Ruth was always way ahead of us with you had to run round putting pictures of animals in boxes, and she'd run round once, memorise where all the boxes were, and always won, whereas the rest of us ran round like headless chickens. The Bent was an amazing house, very old house, and we loved the fact it had an outdoor toilet that had 2 seats, so we could go to the toilet together. Can you imagine that now?
And another lady I was very friendly with was called Christine, and I can't think of a second name, but she lives now in Tasmania, and I'm in touch with her on Facebook as well, which is nice to keep up to date, because her mother and my mother were great friends, and she used to grow a lot of apples in the orchard, and she was always bringing things around and grew a lot of vegetables, which her daughter Christine, I have to say, in Tasmania does exactly the same. And she used to bring my mum all these vegetables.
Janet Williamson was another friend who we used to ride with. She was a farmer's daughter. I suppose all my friends were farmers' daughters, or their fathers worked in farming community. That was the nature of Warburton.
My mum and dad met. My father was working at the RAF camp at Padgate, Fernhead really, but they called it Padgate, RAF camp, which is where I learned to drive on there, on all the old roads. And he used to be on duty at the gate. My mother used to have to walk past, and Brian, my brother, his father is different to my dad. And she used to walk past the site pushing Brian in his pram, and they got chatting, and that's how they met. So really, I don't know much more about that. I know that he was on the gate at the RAF camp at Padgate. That's all I really know about that.
Mum and Dad met in, there was an ironmonger's in the village of Lim called Savills, and Mum was in there one day, and Dad came in, and they were introduced, and that's how they met. Dad had come down from London to work at Thames Board Mills for Cubits, and he was lodging in Lim, and that's how they got together and got to know each other.
I'll briefly say where Mum and Dad met. I believe they met in Lim, above Saville's ironmonger's shop. It's all right, I was just making a rendezvous for G&Ts. Mum knew Miss Saville, and she used to go and visit her, and Miss Saville told her about this very nice young man that was staying at the Lim Hotel because he was working at Thames Board Mills. He was a Londoner, and she thought, Miss Saville thought they'd be very well suited. So she invited them both to come and visit her at the same time. And then I'm guessing it was love at first sight. And they went to, Mum was a member of the tennis club, so she took Dad along and they played tennis together. And that's how they met.
Mum and Dad, when I was a small child, well, I remember Mum running the post office and Dad going out to work, and he was fond of his golf. Mum didn't play golf at the time, but she did later. And I remember helping Dad in the garden when I was only about 3, and he sent me for a rake, and I ran to get the rake and stood on the bottom of the rake, and the shaft came and smacked me on the nose. And there were lots of tears then.
My memories of Mum was that she was always incredibly hardworking in the house, also doing odd little bits of work, such as being a beauty counsellor, which was similar to selling cosmetics, really, door to door and doing parties. And as she said, she always managed to keep 4 wheels under her. She was quite a heavy smoker. I can recall her standing ironing with ash dropping onto the clothes and flipping them off. We must have been the bane of her life. She was constantly telling us if we didn't stop it, she'd bang our heads together. I think I was an obnoxious child, actually. Mum had a really tough childhood because her father died when she was 12. I think of a brain tumour or a brain hemorrhage, but his business had gone bust, and I think that the partner he had went off with the money. I don't really know any detail of it, but they went from having gardeners and a housekeeper and a maid to having nothing, no income apart from what the uncles Woolley and Lenny were earning. Mum said she used to have to get up early and clean the fire grates before she went to work, and then or went to school, should I say, and then help her mother with the housework when she came home. But her mother would never let people know how bad things were, and they used to have tennis parties on the back lawn, and Mum said from somewhere her mother would magic up sandwiches and afternoon tea, and as they were put on the table it was always FHB, family hold back. And Mum said that her friends would be eating things she had not seen for ages, and then when they'd gone they'd probably have bread and jam.
What do you remember about your parents when you were a small child? Well, not very good things, I'm afraid. Growing up wasn't the easiest of places in Queen's Crescent. My mum and dad had many, many fights, and don't really want to dwell on it, but it wasn't pleasant. I was very grateful and thankful that I had Sylvia, because Sylvia was my saving grace when I was growing up. Brian, I don't remember a lot of because by the time I was 8, he was married and gone. So, or back probably 7 actually. But my mum had a lot of problems, I think, psychological problems. And my dad had a lot to put up with. And by the time I was 11, my father had left us 3 times. But when I was 11, he went for good. And I never saw my father, never laid eyes on my father after that. And my mum brought us up. But it wasn't a pleasant childhood. Lot of fighting, lot of arguments, lot of knife throwing. Sounds dreadful. So I'm surprised I'm normal, really. But perhaps you don't think I am.
I remember Mum was looking absolutely stunning when she used to go out to ladies' evenings and dances. She had some beautiful, well, I thought, beautiful dresses, and to me, she was like a fairy princess. And I remember we used to watch Come Dancing, where they all have the layers and layers of net skirts, and I used to say to her, when I'm rich, I'll buy you a dress like that.
I also remember playing football against the garage door. I was in goal, and Dad and Uncle Jack were kicking the ball at me, and they were kicking it so hard they thought it was a big joke, and I was absolutely terrified. It kept going past me and hitting the door with a big bang, and I was in tears, and they thought it was a wonderful joke. They were laughing their heads off.
What did you say?
Pardon?
Poor thing.
When Mum did have a bit of time to spare, she would sometimes take us down to the fox covert, down through Clegg's farm, and it was just a little wood down there. And she'd take tubes of Smarties, and we'd ask the fairies for some sweets, and then we'd play hide and seek. And when we came back, there'd be sweets at the bottom of the trees. Quite amazing.
Mum used to smoke woodbine, cigarette in those days. I remember she used to be working away with a woodbine hanging out of the corner of her mouth, puffing away.
I love that.
And she had a friend, Auntie Muggy, who was a childhood friend who lived in Buxton in Derbyshire. So she'd sometimes take us over there in the car. We'd go over the Cap and Fiddle, which was really steep, and we thought it was terribly exciting. Auntie Muggy lived with her friend Helen. They were both school teachers, and they had a lovely cottage on the edge just outside Buxton with a stream running through that had watercress growing in it. So Mum always used to come home with lots of watercress.
But they gave me an awful lot of freedom. I used to disappear for hours on end, and they never knew where I was, and come back when I felt like it.
Still do.
Still do.
Dad used to spend a lot of time at the golf club and at Freemasons. I don't recall many days when we spent with Dad, but I think that's just the way things were then. Woolley and Lenny were absolutely amazing, and like having 2 extra dads, and they used as spoilers rotten. But they gave us the most precious gift. They gave us their time. It was them who... Dad bought our bikes for us, our first bikes, but it was Woolley and Lenny who taught us to ride them. And I can remember Uncle Lenny holding onto the saddle as I tried to cycle around the lawn, and I'm shouting, "Don't let go, don't let go," and then hearing his voice several yards behind, and I immediately fell off. But they had great patience with us, and then we used to go out on bike rides. They'd take us out on bike rides. We'd get home and Mum would say, "Where did you go?" We'd say, "Well, we started at the Bay Malton, then we went to the Axe and Cleaver, then we went to the Swan with 2 Nicks, and then we went to the Rope and Anchor." So we did a nice little pub crawl, and we used to have orange juice and watch the men playing bowls, and found it all very exciting.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Signing off.